Okay, hello everyone. This is the lecture on co-design. It's a pre-recorded lecture, and I would like to ask you to make sure you have seen this lecture before we get to work with it in class. So the program for today is divided in a number of chapters, and the first chapters you really need to see. But chapter 6 is an overview of a lot of different techniques. This chapter you can sort of browse through. If there are certain techniques that you like, then you might want to hear what I have to say about them. If there are certain techniques that you're not going to use anyway, or think you're not going to use, then you can also skip these. So that part is much longer than the actual lecture. But I'm just giving it to you as a kind of background knowledge that you can dig into when you need it. And then chapter 7, Design Your Own CoDesign Workshop, is just getting started with the stuff that we're going to do in class as well. Right, so let's start with the beginning. What is co-design and how do we define it? So let's turn to chapter 1. What is co-design? Switching to the left here, what is co-design? I put together my own definition. Co-design, I say, is an organized process involving one or more collaborative generative activities with the aim to finding out, together with stakeholders, in particular the intended end users, what would be desired qualities of a to-be designed product if that product would be used in the intended real-world use context, as experienced by and reflected on from the perspective of the intended end user. I try to make my definition as complex as possible so we have something to talk about. No, that's a joke, but all these terms say something that is important. So I will briefly go past the key words here that I'm using. So first of all, collaborative activity. You cannot have co-design if you just work by yourself alone. So it's always about people working together towards something. The activity is generative. I will say much more about that later. But the word generative comes from to generate. And this is different from analyzing. So it's about generation or creation of something together. You're not just analyzing what is there, but you are together creating something new that wasn't there before. Stakeholder is a person or a representative of a group of people who has a stake, an interest in the project and its outcome. So you could ask, who are all the people for which my project in the end matters? And for who does the project matter most? Of course, the end user is one stakeholder, is always a stakeholder. But there's other people who may not directly use the product, but they are still, it matters to them whether the project fails or succeeds. They are all stakeholders. Then you have the intended end user, one of the stakeholders. That's the person that is going to be using the product if it all works out well. Right, so the envisioned future user of the product. Then you have the real world use context, with which I mean not some kind of laboratory setting or a test setup or the university, but the actual world out there where your product is going to be used in practice. And then you have the experience and perspective of the end user. So we're going to look at what would it be like to be using this product, not looking at it from a designer's perspective, but or a researcher perspective. But the designer and researcher are trying to really step into the shoes of the end user and look at the use of the product and what it means, what it feels like, whether it works. And if we say the product works, we mean the end user has the feeling that it works. The end user says, oh, this is a product that really works for me. Right? That is the definition of really empathizing with the end user. Now there's also a lot of research, academic research on co-design and especially participatory design, which is a related term. For example, Sanders and Stappers was a very famous paper in 2008. They say co-design involves the collective creativity as it is applied across the whole span of a design process, involving the collective creativity of designers and of people not trained in design working together in a design development process. So they're talking about co-design as something that doesn't happen at one particular moment in a design process. It happens in various stages of the design process. Then you really have a co-design project. And you are not just co-designing with other designers or other professional design team or something like that. The collective creativity also involves the people that are not trained in design, but they are stakeholders, end users, and so on. They are brought into the design process. Well, this is a very general definition, of course. It can mean any kind of thing. According to Siemens and Robertson, who have a handbook on participatory design, and they also write about the whole history of it, there's a number of things that always return in participatory design projects. So, and these are not just functional, they are also political in a way. So why are we doing co-design? There's always something to do with equalizing power relations. So not just the designer has a say, but also other people also get to have a say in what we should design. So it's about democratic practices. Everybody can join in and be heard. Everybody who has a stake in the project should also have a say in the project. It's about situation-based action. So we look really, what does it mean for this product to be used in actual real-world context and not just in abstract procedures or policies, but what does it mean down on the ground where people are working in factories or at home using consumer products and being frustrated that the thing is not user-friendly and so on. It's really about diving into real situations. It's about mutual learning. Designers learn from users, users learn from designers. So every design project is actually a learning project. That is why reflecting on what you are doing is very important, because if you only do stuff together but you don't step back and reflect on it and say, hey, what did we learn from it, then there's no learning process. And that's actually the most important part of the whole deal. And there's always a whole bunch of tools and techniques involved, and that's of course what you're also going to be concerned with by applying some of these tools and techniques, and also maybe bringing your own stuff and ideas to the table to make a very good co-design activity. And what that all leads to is always about creating alternative, new visions about technology, about how to use things. It's almost always about sort of taking a new, fresh look at something and not just taking the standard interpretations that you would immediately jump into as a designer if you wouldn't be doing co-design, right? So the idea of co-design is that it gives you a new, fresh perspective that you couldn't have thought up just by yourself. So there's a number of related terms in the literature. The most important one here is participatory design. For the purposes of this lecture and this course, you can just exchange the words co-design and participatory design. I mean the same by it. Historically, there is a difference, and I will go a little bit into the history of participatory design, whereas later on, whereas co-design as a term comes more out of commercial industry and software user interface design, and it's more US based, whereas participatory design comes out of Scandinavian design work. I will say more about that later. And then there's a whole bunch of related terms that just have to do with how do we make sure that the interests and values and needs of users are made central in the design process more generally, and often within these fields, user-led design, user-initiated design, inclusive design, design for all, human-centered design is a very broad term. User-centered design is a more old-fashioned forerunner of human-centered design. All of those names refer to ways of doing design that quite naturally invite co-design techniques and methods. But not all of them necessarily do co-design. You can also not do co-design, but still really try to design an inclusive product. But in my personal opinion, it just makes sense to involve the people that you want to include in your design, to also include them in your design process, right? It feels like the natural thing to do, but it's not necessarily the same. So today we will mainly be focusing on one particular flavor of what you could call co-design, which is to do a workshop in which you invite people, or you go to their location and you say, okay, let's get together. You bring some materials and you're going to do something like a creative workshop with a number of people, right? The co-design workshop. Of course, there's other ways of doing co-design, and I just want to point out, for example, in academic research, co-design is often used much more like a research method, and then the focus is also on getting information about user groups and their needs, much more than directly designing a product. So you do creative activities, but the goal is to get information. So this is called sometimes context mapping research. And in your project, we have used this term to refer to the very first part of your project, where you went to the user to do an interview and a site visit. But you can also do all kinds of creative activities for the same purpose of getting more clear on what the problem really is, what the user really is like, what they need, their important characteristics, and so on. You can also do more co-design kind of activities when the product is already on the market, when it's already being used in the real world or in the wild, so to speak. But then often it goes very slow, because you're just going to work on the next version of your product with strong involvement of the actual users of your current version. But especially in software, when you design apps, that is a common way of working, right? You don't wait until you have the perfect product before putting it out on the market. You just bring out your first version, and then immediately you start to iterate, getting fast feedback from your user group. So you could also call that co-design, but it goes it's a bit more, it's not a one workshop thing, it's more like a whole timeline of steps. And if you take it even longer, you could say, I'm going to really set up this sort of long-term strategic collaboration more at the policy level, where, I don't know, universities, societal organizations, industry, maybe local governments are working together on, let's say, how are we in the Netherlands going to deal with water management, droughts, the danger of floodings in the near future given climate change. And then you're going to involve everybody. So that's a much more long-term and high-level kind of co-design, you could say. And much more down at the down on the ground level. There's also, of course, a lot of communities nowadays who make their own things, right? There's just maker spaces, fab labs, do-it-yourself communities, people who work with old clothing, turning it into something new, recycling stuff. all of that you could sort of call co-design, but here it's not even organized by a design agency or a design. It's not even a design project to begin with. It's just users making things for themselves, right? And sometimes researchers and designers also sort of hook on to that. So they just start to collaborate with and facilitate those kinds of processes without being actually the leader or the initiator of those communities and initiatives. So that's sort of flipping the whole thing around, right? But we're going to just talk about, let's say, the standard classic co-design workshop. So here's just a list of things to read. These websites are pretty easy accessible. For example, the Make Tools website is a nice one with many methods, things you can download as well, developed over the years by Liz Sanders and Pieter-Jan Stappers. Pieter-Jan Stappers is a professor, almost retired, I think now, in Delft, who is one of the people who really put co-design on the map, at least definitely also in the Netherlands. Chapter 2. Why are we doing co-design? Something of the history and background. And I want to say up front that maybe you think this is a boring part. Maybe you even already wanted to skip it. Don't skip it. The reason you don't want to skip this is that the actual practical implementation of co-design and the tips and tricks that I want to give you later on, like, oh, this is what you could do, that is what you can do, they actually make much less sense if you don't understand why you are trying to do what you want to do. So if you have no idea why you want to do co-design and what the sort of concepts and principles behind it are, then any practical method, canvas, working with Lego, whatever, it doesn't make any sense anymore. You just have no clue what you're doing, right? And if we flip that around, if you really know why you want to do what you do, and if you know the idea behind it, then basically you can very easily invent your own methods and your own workshops. Because there is no cookbook recipe for how to do co-design. The most important content of the lecture is why do it and with what purpose and based on what principles, so that you then can choose and do the things that you in your project with your user group and for your context think is most sensible, practical, fun to do, right? So for each setting you need to adapt existing methods and basically invent the wheel again a little bit. There's no going around that, because in co-design you want to connect to the user and their context, and that's different each time for each project, right? You all have different target groups, target users, so every co-design session will be already different for all of you. So that's why you need to understand this part actually much more deeply than the whole list of possible methods and techniques that you could use that I will introduce later as just by inspiration. So to understand why you want to do co-design or participatory design, we need to go back to the original history of it. And well, as I said, there's multiple histories. The whole idea developed in multiple places, but I want to go back to Scandinavia. And in the 1980s of the last century, there was an interesting situation where on the one hand you had a lot of unemployment, and many social scientists, people studying psychology, sociology, anthropology, they actually went into IT because the whole computer business started to grow, and that's where you could actually still find work. And also people in the university were more and more, of course, interested in this whole new information technology business the development of computers. There was no internet. It was all new. The first desktop computers were being made. And what you had in industry, for example, in the desktop publishing industry, people making newspapers, magazines, and so on, they were moving from really handwork, right? Handcrafted layout making, paper cutting, and so on, to the first interfaces on computers for making layouts of printed media. And so many of these workers were now being asked, or rather forced, to work with these new tools. And of course the idea was that the work would be more easy. But the interesting thing was that in the beginning of that, nobody was asking the professionals what would actually be a very handy application for them to have, and what the interface should look like, and how it would be easy to work with it or not. So they were being confronted with new tools, new machines that they had to work with, but which very often didn't work for them at all. And now at the same time, in many of these IT companies that were making these applications, you had all these social scientists and anthropologists that were unemployed before and went into IT. And they were looking at the development processes of these new technologies in a very different way than their colleagues who really came out of computer engineering or mathematics or what have you in those days. So you had suddenly a sort of human perspective being brought into this new emerging IT business. And very quickly, these people in the IT companies started to work together with university professors. For example, Pelle Een, one of the founding fathers of participatory design. And he started very quickly to do projects in which the desktop publishing professionals were being asked to help out design these computer artifacts that they would have to be using in their daily work. And there's a second very important historical fact of that time, that in Scandinavia the unions, the worker unions, always have been very powerful. So basically nothing really happens without the unions giving consent, at least in those days. And this meant that the unions really also demanded that workers would have a say in the design of these new technologies. So that also gave leverage and power for these researchers to actually start doing these projects, and that also managers and CEOs had to take it seriously, because otherwise the unions would just shut down the whole factory. So that was interesting. And as Pelle Een says also in his writings on these early days, it was always at the same time two goals. The one was the political goal, workers, just people that have to use a tool, just should be able to have a say in how the tool gets designed, because they will become dependent on these tools. And otherwise it would be just ethically, it would be oppressive to force people to use certain tools that they didn't have any say about, right? It would decrease their freedom to do things in the way they wanted to do things. So that was the political, ethical goal. All these co-design projects were really also about empowering the user, and in this case also the worker in a factory, to have more power over their own everyday work life. And at the same time, the goal was also always technical, instrumental, with which I mean, if you ask people what they need of a tool that they have to use every day, and if you take them seriously as, let's say, experts of their own work practices, then most probably you just get a better interface and you just get a better tool, right? They have knowledge that you lack because you are not a professional in that field. A second historical development that was important was that at some point Sanders and Stappers they wrote an influential paper that sort of showed this historical development in design and engineering, where traditionally there was always already some attention to researching human factors and ergonomics. So that's all the way in the left bottom corner of this picture. And that was done by researchers who were separate from designers. So specialist human factors and ergonomics researchers with a training in psychology and experimental psychology and doing questionnaires and measurements and so on and observations. They would come in to a company or whatever, and they would measure, I don't know. So for example, if you make a tank for the defense industry, vehicle that soldiers have to be in, you need to measure the average height of a soldier, because otherwise you're not sure that everybody fits into this machine, right? And how high should the handles be for people to be able to grab and manipulate them, and if you want to show a light, which lights are easy to distinguish, which different colors should you use, and so on. So that kind of research was already there quite early on, but it was very much research oriented, and it was not about really involving people into the design. It was more like seeing them as a kind of subject. So users, these soldiers, were seen as objects out there that you as a researcher were investigating as a research subject. So led by researchers, and the user is a subject that needs to be observed, measured, analyzed in order to get the right information for the right sort, for making the correct design. And then you basically saw over the years a kind of trend in design research towards what Sanders and Stapper started calling generative design, with using generative tools. So in generative design, the designer is the initiative, has the initiative. So designers are, as part of their design process, saying, hey, we want to do something with users of the product that we are going, and we're not going to ask the researchers to do it. We're going to involve users ourselves, and we're going to involve users not as research subjects, as guinea pigs. We're going to involve them as true partners to think with us about the design. At this point would be a good moment to stand up from your screen, even for just 1 minute, and look outside to have a long view and save your eyes. So this history, this background, leads to a number of core principles of co-design that are the topic of chapter 3. First is this idea of these generative methods. So generative you should see as opposite to analytical. So what are analytic methods? Those are the traditional methods of science. So the traditional methods in science is there is some kind of situation out there. I'm behind my screen. I'm now looking out through the window at a field where kids are playing. So out there, through the window, I see a world. And I, as a researcher, want to find out what is out there in the world. And I want to analyze it, observe it, and model it, and get as good as possible an understanding of the world out there. So I want to analyze and explain reality as it is now. Right? So for example, what do people think of their workplace? So I find these people and I say, what do you think of the workplace? And they fill in my questionnaire, and then I know what do they think of the current workplace. I'm not really designing anything yet, right? I'm just analyzing the situation. And this is what you probably, and I'm guessing here, what you probably think when people say, I'm going to do research. So the word research is mostly used for these analytic, empirical methods, finding out what is the case. And when you start to design something, come up with an idea, you probably don't call this research. You just say, yeah, now I've now done my research, I'm now going to do design, right? Now, the interesting thing is that generative methods, they sort of mix research and design together. So instead of asking people, what do you think of your current workplace? I ask people, what kind of workplace would you like to have? And I give you all kinds of creative tools with which you can visualize and create your ideal future workplace. So it is sort of research. I'm finding out things. I'm creating new insights, right? First, we didn't know what kind of workplace people would like to have, and at the end, we know what kind of workplace they like to have. But it's not just an analysis of what was already there, because we have together, collaboratively, created something new. So we're sort of investigating a possible future instead of the situation as it is right now. And that is something that social scientists and psychologists often don't understand very well. It doesn't fit into their model of what research is about, because research is also always about the reality, and the reality is not a future possibility, is not yet reality, right? So how can you research that? Well, design researchers say, well, you can research that, and you use generative methods for that. You ideate, imagine, fantasize, you create, you build, you construct together. And of course, you also need to then reflect on that and together discuss, so what does it all mean that we have now fantasized together? What are the underlying meanings behind it? Right, so in a design, in a research or design project, so it's both research and design. You are trained as designers, but you are trained at the university, so at the academic level. And part of what makes it academic is not just that you do all kinds of research around the actual design process, but also that you can use your design process in a research heavy way, so that you can use generative methods to find out what people desire to be the new reality. That's a way of doing design as also a part of doing research. So, and an example of that is, okay, I wish to have this in my future workplace because I don't like that about my current workplace. Then you get the mix, actually, right? So you can use generative methods to find out possible futures, but then the next step is you can also use generative methods to find out what they actually don't like about the current situation. Yeah. So basically what I was trying to say is, as a design researcher, you use both. You use analytic and generative methods, and you can use the one in order to get a sense of the other as well. Second principle, so we have analytic versus generative, and co-design is a generative method, and that gives you kind of knowledge that you don't get by purely doing traditional forms of research. Second is a very important principle, that we take the user to be the expert of their own life. And life has something to do with the way you experience your life and also the way you live your life, right? So only the user has private access to their own lived experience. What does it feel like for me to ride on this bike, to sleep in this tent, to make this coffee with this coffee machine? And only the user has private access to the meanings that are found in my life world. What does my coffee machine mean to me? Why is it so important to me? What does it do for me? You may have a completely different experience of your coffee machine. And if you're the designer of my coffee machine, then probably you look at my coffee machine in an altogether different way. Because it's just not the same kind of thing to look at a coffee machine from a designer's perspective then it is to look at a coffee machine from the person actually using it every day. So there's this sort of core hunch, or you might call it a hypothesis maybe. So the idea, the assumption of co-design is that you need to, if you don't find out about these lived experiences and these live worlds, these everyday realities that people live in, if you leave that out, you get a bad product, right? So a to-be designed product should fit well with the lived experiences and the life world of the user. If you don't do that, what do you get? You get frustration, aversion, misunderstanding. People make errors in using your product. Their entire well-being will be down the drain. They will be disempowered. They feel they have no control over things, or they can't use it well. You know, if you want to use a tool and it constantly doesn't work, you get frustrated again. And eventually what happens, of course, is you stop using it. Right? If you have the choice of doing that. So there's two things here that are ethically very interesting. One is many things we have to use because, for example, in our job, it's just demanded of us that we use this particular kind of tool or technology. If it's then something that doesn't fit with our experience and our way of doing things, then we feel disempowered. And if we have the freedom of choice and the product just doesn't do it for us, it doesn't work well, then we're just not going to use it. So, there you go. Next principle, collaborative sense making. The idea is that for many problems, it's not going to be one person who's going to find out the solution, right? So if we assume that we're going to do kind of a group think, we're going to design the product together, then this means that we're actually making sense collaboratively. We're making sense of what the actual problem is that we want to design for, the details of the challenge, and what could be a sensible solution. And we do this in interaction, right? So it's not just me having an idea and then telling it to you, and then you say, oh, now I also have the idea. Oh, I have another idea, and then you tell it to me again. That goes much quicker. So we constantly build off of one another. I respond to what you said. I suddenly have an idea because you've said something in a certain way, and so on. And it's very hard to exchange the more abstract or hidden or values or beliefs, things that I can't even put to words, or I wasn't even conscious of having these beliefs or values or experiences, right? Because I'm not constantly, I don't know anything consciously what goes on in my life. So it's very hard to talk about that if you cannot somehow make that concrete and tangible. And the co-design practice makes these things tangible such that you can actually collaboratively make sense together. So collaborative sense making, it needs what is called scaffolds. So scaffold is the word for what a painter that is painting a roof standing on scaffolds, right, at the side of the house. You need these kind of stepping stones that make it easier for multiple people to communicate with one another. So you need materials, tools, and creative spaces that help participants make sense together in interaction with one another. If we're only talking, it's very hard. If we're not even talking, I can't guess what you're thinking at all. So the best way for people to very quickly get aligned with one another and inspire each other and get creative in response to each other in an interactive way is to put things in between. And these could be sketches, construction materials, creative materials, canvases, certain questions to work on, other kinds of tools. You can use Legos, you can use clay, Play-Doh, whatever. Stuff that makes it easier for me to say, oh, I mean something like this, and then you could respond to that and say, oh, if you mean that, then I also have an idea, let's add this to it, and so on. So you need the this and the that kind of stuff in between ourselves so that we can understand each other better. So that's an important working mechanism that these different techniques and tools and materials in co-design make possible. Next principle, empowering the user. So this is the ethical part of it. Design projects are always also power structures with stakeholders defending their stakes, right? So this is something that you may not always be consciously aware of or focusing on. You might think, oh, we just want to design a good product with a good functionality, right? And we want to find out what the product should do and how it should do it and how to make sure it's user friendly and so on. And that all sounds very in a way, well, you wouldn't say it's political, right? The word politics you wouldn't necessarily use for designing a product. But you could say that every product is in a way a little bit political. It has influence on what people can do. So a product influences what people can do and how they can do what they do. And thereby, every product has also influence on how people relate to one another. So if I make a product that allows you to have access to all the information in the organization, and I distribute that product to every worker in the organization, then suddenly everybody has access to all the information in the organization. That has influence on management and on who gets to have a say about things, right? But on the other hand, if I make a whole detailed system of access where only some workers have access to some kind of information, I mean, this is the standard, of course, how we usually do it, at least in the Netherlands, then that just as well has influence on who has power over what, right? So you as a designer are also partly responsible for creating different kinds of power dynamics between people that are going to use your product. And very often the people that actually have to use your product are at the receiving end. They often have a marginalized position in that, right? So the CEO or the manager gives you an assignment to design something and all the workers in the organization have little say about it. This is what Pelle Een in the 1980s in Scandinavia thought, okay, I'm going to push back against that a little. I'm going to make sure that the people that have to use the products also have a say in what the product should look like. So in co-design, there's also an ethical value. So it's ethically, not just pragmatically, it's not just practically desirable, but it's also ethically desirable to empower the end user in the design process, to level the playing field a little bit, as it were. Right? So, maybe you can't always influence the power dynamics of the final practice in which your product is going to be used, but then at least you could help make sure that in the design process of the product, it's not just not only the person that is paying for the new product, only your traditional client, the company owner who hires you to design a product for them. It's not just that one person that has to can have a say about what the product should look like, but also other people involved. I once did a programming course where in certain points within the chapters there were these sayings like, now you can have a peanut butter sandwich. So now you can have a healthy snack. So how do you go about doing a co-design process? Well, there's many different models and there's many different ways of approaching it. There's not one true cookbook recipe like this is how you should do it. I'm just offering you one model that we developed in Twente, and it's called the Design Your Life model. It's not rocket science. It looks very much like many other comparable design thinking models, but it's just one that we give you that we think makes sense. It goes through a number of quite logical steps that remind you of a general design process. But then for each step in the design process, of course, there's different ways in which you then involve the end user and other stakeholders in that process instead of doing everything by yourself. So just very briefly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you could say that classic product development is more linear, and it has research and the beginning about what is a market opportunity, what do customers want. It is also much more focused on a, let's say, a more traditional commercial context where you want to bring a product to the market and really make money out of it. Nothing wrong with that, but that's just that's the background of how this kind of models evolved and this way of working. And then you have your concept design and detailing materials. That often that's where designers really think, here's where we start the design process. So that means that the requirements and the market research and what really needs to be designed is already done, and the problem is already clear, and then you get a whole design process towards a final product. Right? Now, this is really different because here the focus is really on engineering the solution. So from the clear problem definition, you work it out all the way until a final product, and there's much more time and energy and money spent on engineering the product and setting up the production process, for example, which is hidden behind me right now in the model, and it's more linear. Whereas co-design, it has a number of iterations that is not clearly defined from the start. So you could think, if you are thinking really fast, you think, okay, so then how the hell do I know when my project ends? And of course, how is that then possible in a real world where there's real budgets and time constraints and people only have so many hours to work on things? Well, that stays the same, but that just means that you have to do project management in a very different way. So this means that you define a number of iterations, and you just say, well, whatever it takes, we're going to deliver a new prototype after this iteration. And it might not be the perfect prototype, and we may have to make all kinds of choices based on assumptions or incomplete knowledge, right? Because we really want to have the iteration finished there and then. So you don't finish an iteration when the content is finally there. You just finish the iteration when you want to finish it, and you say, whatever it takes, we need to have the content. And this can mean that the result is maybe less detailed or less precise or less complete. But that doesn't matter, because you have a different way of getting to completeness. It's not about first finishing everything and then moving to the next step. It's doing rounds and rounds. Like first you make a sketch, then you make a more detailed sketch, then you start inking the sketch, then you start coloring, right? How you make a drawing. It's more like that. And so the focus is much more on these early parts where you need to get clear on what the problem really is, and you already start prototyping solutions, partly still also in order as a tool for making sense together with the end user about what the problem really is about, right? So you already start making ideas and generating ideas, and even in that process it can still be that you revisit and reframe the problem and the challenge. Oh, really, this project is really about this. And we found that out because we have generated 20 ideas for solutions. And by evaluating the solutions, we came to see that actually the problem that we're trying to solve together is a different problem than we thought initially. And for many things that people need, whenever humans are involved, this might be the only way of doing it, because the problems are often hidden, complex, multifaceted, many things interacting. So these are not the easy kind of problems that you can just think out from behind your drawing board. You need to try something and then evaluate together. So that's what you do in these iterations, right? So it's more iterative. You go in sort of circles, gradually moving towards the center. The main focus is on what they call the fuzzy front end. So that is the early part of the design process, much more than the later engineering part. You still need to do the engineering later. But you may already have viable prototypes that are, so the idea of course is that the idea would be that you have need less time for detailed engineering because you're already trying out prototypes in earlier iterations. And there's this more iterative logic to how you get to your results. Right? So, of course, this comes a little bit from software. In software, you can very easily throw something in the world and say, hey, try this out. I've got this new app. You just find the 20 users and you sort of develop your app as they are using it, right? That's where it comes from. For physical products, it's more challenging because you have to spend a lot of time making a prototype at some point, and there still needs to be a very serious engineering part in the end, because otherwise things are just dangerous or they break or whatever. So I'm not denying that, but this iterative stuff might be useful when you are not very clear yet on the problem and you really want to involve all the knowledge from all the different stakeholders into defining what the problem is really about, rather than inventing it in your head, and then maybe being wrong and only finding out much later when you put your engineered product on the market and it turns out that it just doesn't fulfill the need at all. And so famous argument for doing a lot in the fuzzy front end and spending some more time and money also on the fuzzy front end is that, relatively speaking, making changes in the fuzzy front end, making early prototypes and then changing them and making a new one, 3D printing 100 prototypes or whatever, is still much cheaper than being wrong in the engineering phase. Finding out later when you have your whole production line set up and people are already producing your product in series, and you've got your whole marketing and sales set up, and then you find out you've got the wrong product, right? So the cost of making changes later are much bigger. So what you want to do is you want to make a lot of mistakes and early on in the fuzzy front end, learn from them, and then be sure that when you really start to invest money and things are getting more fixed and less easily adaptable, that you know you are really on the right track. This is my cat, Guus. He says hello to you all. Do you have a favorite animal? Send me an email with a photo of your favorite animal. It could be your own pet or maybe just the funniest animal you think there exists on this planet. I'm happy to receive them. So in the next chapter, chapter 5, is a case study about a project that I did a number of years ago. I think it could be very interesting to really hear the story of how it went and the kind of stuff that I ran into and how I tried to solve that and deal with it. However, for now, I'm going to leave this, so you can skip through the slides if you want. And when I have time, I will make a good story out of it and add it, and then you can have a look at it later. It is not really necessary to hear about this in order to start with your own exercises. So then I leave it for now, so I can already upload the slides as is, and I will make a new version later to tell you about this project. It was a nice project, but you'll have to wait a little bit to hear all about it. Chapter 6, Co-Design Techniques. Now there's a lot of techniques, so this chapter is really for your reference. browse through the techniques, through the slides, and when you see something you like, maybe you want to hear what I have to say about it, but it would be too long, I think, to listen to all of this. So just make a choice and get inspired. So many of the techniques we developed ourselves in the past. We've done bigger projects, for example, together with the Hogeschool Utrecht, working with many different user groups and inventing all kinds of methods and techniques. And I'm just want to show you some of these. And of course, we have the Design Your Life toolkit, which is also available in your education environment in Canvas. And in that, there's a whole list of exercises that you can choose from. You can adapt them to your own needs. You can add creative materials, make it fun. These are just starting points for you to work with. But if you find it difficult to just come out with something out of your own mind, you might just want to follow some of these exercises and get started. Okay, so one fun exercise that is really part of the context mapping, really, so which you basically already did, but still you can also use some of this maybe as a starting point in your workshop, is to make a visual timeline and let the participant fill in a typical day of their life. What happens in that day, how are routines structured, who else is involved, what things, tools and objects are involved, what are crucial moments during the day, where do things go wrong, or what are actually the fun parts of the day, where are the challenges, and where in this timeline, that's then of course the next step later on, where in this timeline would this new project actually be needed, right? So then you sort of put the use of the product in the context of an everyday life experience of a person. And you can have, people can make photos of their everyday, or they can find photos from a big set of photos that you provide them with for inspiration. They can put stickers with emoticons next to it. They can put time stamps on it, comments, sticky notes, whatever you like. Make it rich, make a rich material, let people talk about it, and so on. And of course, you can do a day in life, but you can also do an hour of work, right? If you want to focus more at the micro level of how does a work task evolve. You come in the morning, you drink the coffee, then you go to the machine, and then what do you do, and then what do you do, and then what do you do, and when is it then finished? Storyboards. So a very important part in design thinking is to work in terms of stories and in terms of narratives, where people take you through the story of how things happen, a little bit like the previous example as well, right? So you can make a storyboard by making a visual representation. If people are afraid of drawing themselves, you can also make prefabricated little drawings that they can put on as stickers, or maybe they can cut out things from magazines or from photos that you've printed out and stick them on and make a collage, and then let them tell the story of how things happen. In this case, this was about an elderly person using the bike to go to the library, and then she was afraid of falling when it was snowy, and so on and so forth, and where to put the bike and how to lock it, and everything. So there was a whole story around using a bike on the public road when you are an elderly person, and we investigated that with the person in question by making a storyboard. And it can be, this is just one picture, but a storyboard can of course also literally be a comic book type of with a number of frames that take you through the timeline. So this is called a future map, and a future map is basically a kind of visual representation of people's thoughts and deeper ideas and values. How do they see themselves, and what do they want to achieve in life? So you start at the bottom right and you go counterclockwise. First you think about, what do I find important, what are my qualities, what do I find difficult, what is challenging, and what do I then want to reach, what do I want to achieve, what goals do I have, and then you could make a little scenario of how that could be achieved or what would be needed in order to get there, for example. So by mapping the values and qualities, you learn about what motivates people and what drives them. So photo diary is a nice exercise that you can ask people to do at home in between sessions. So if you do multiple workshops, for example, you could say during the day make 12 photos of the environment in which you find yourself, and then you can have them send the photos to you through a safe channel, and then you get a whole sort of implicit storyline, and often you use those photos later on when you then really have a workshop together. You could print out all those photos, put them on the wall, or put them on a canvas or on a table, and make cards out of them, for example. So you could use that material as creative material later on to build off of. Same kind of thing would be sensitizer. So you give people small, fun, creative exercises to do, like filling in a small diary with pictures and questions in it, already pre-printed. And then ask people to fill that in, and they bring it to the workshop that you do with them. So they do it in advance, like homework, but not of course boring homework, so you should make it nice. And then they bring it, and they already have something to tell. They already come in with a story, with materials that they want to share with you, which makes them also much more motivated to doing the workshop with you. A home safari, very basically, you let the participant walk around the house or the work environment, or wherever it is that you want to get more clear on the situation, the context, and you have them make photos or video showing their living environment and things important to them. You can make the photos, or they can make the photos themselves, and you can discuss the photos or the video together with asking questions like, what is it? Can you explain more about that? Ask open questions. Of course, you need to be very careful with this kind of material, because you are photographing people's private lives, right? So I, for example, ask permission to use these photos here to show to you. Yeah, you do this. This is also really part of a typical context mapping exercise on beforehand, and then you can use these photos and the videos and the reflections on it as starting point for really brainstorming ideas. Variation would be to have people walk around the situation where you want to improve something, and then have them literally put sticky notes on the environment. So paste the sticky note on the staircase, and then have a comment on why is this not accessible for wheelchairs, for example, could be, and then make a photo out of that. So you have a sort of annotated photo. Then we really get to the creative idea generation, the ideation materials. What you want, of course, is to bring stuff with which people can generate ideas. People don't just generate ideas in their heads. You need to help them, especially if they are not professional designers. You want to give materials to them that sort of invites them constructing or making or building something, which then in their hands becomes part of the idea generation process. Yeah, so what people say, this is something that Sanders and Stappers emphasize a lot. What people say, it doesn't always represent what they really feel. So if you make things together, then you also create a kind of ambiguity, because a prototype like the one in the bottom left is like a mock-up for a kind of interactive tablet interface, right? Just made with little drawings and blocks and things that were available in the toolkit. Around that object, users are often able to tell a much more rich story about why it really is important to them, or what they really feel or think about it at a more deeper level than when you just ask them sitting around the table, what kind of project would you like? What kind of product would you like? That doesn't work. A fun variation of these toolkits is to use Velcro. It's done by many people in the literature also. Why? Because you can make kind of physical canvases, like a mock-up of a tablet interface or a mock-up of a physical interactive object that is there at the top. And then you can have all kinds of possible features and things and buttons and objects, and you make the Velcro on them so that people can stick them on and really make a physical. So rather than making a collage in 2D, you sort of can make a collage in 3D and make an impression of a new kind of product that doesn't exist yet. Now you can make a mock-up together, like what you just saw, but with the thing, for example, with a Velcro artifact that you made together, and it has a story behind it. You can also play out that story literally by enacting it as a little theater play. So you say, okay, I'm gonna be your colleague and you're gonna be you, and here's the new product. It doesn't exist yet, but this Velcro thing or this cardboard thing is the new product. And then you tell me how we're gonna use the product. So first what we do, oh, you press it, oh, and then comes the next step is that a little light shows. Okay, then you just quickly grab a red sticker and say, oh, the light is now on. And then, so you step by step, you just play out the scenario, you play out the story of how the product would be used in steps. It doesn't need to be in real timing, of course. It goes often very slow with talks in between and discussion. That doesn't matter. That's all the better. It's all about figuring out together what the product really is all about, rather than just what it looks like. Because a product only gets its meaning in using it, right? In really doing something with the product. So you need to also try out the steps of actually using it rather than only what it physically looks like. A variation on this, when you don't have an idea for the product yet, but you do have some ideas about what the product should actually do, or the context in which the product is used. Maybe you don't even yet know exactly what the product should do. You don't know what it should look like yet. You could use just what they call a black box object. It doesn't need to be black, of course, that's just metaphorical, but some kind of random object that has a kind of generic shape. So you could use, I have here, for example, a bottle of wax. You just make it one color and you say, this is a magic thing, and now you are going to enact your everyday task. You're going to do the task, and now this thing is a magical object that solves your problem when it arises. So you let people then talk about, oh, what the problem that I always have is here and here I can't do this, and this is not possible, or this always goes wrong. And then you say, okay, now you have the magic object. What should the object now do in order to solve your problem? And then they can say with the thing in their hand, it might be for some people at least more easy to then suddenly imagine, oh, I want this to have a button, and when I press the button, immediately this or this or this happens, and there's the solution. Now, I really value the power of tinkering. So tinkering means just fabricating, improvised, making something, exploring ideas by really making something physical rather than just talking about it, and also rather than only drawing it or only writing something in text, right? So writing has its value, making stories has its value, visualizing with drawing has its value, but physically making the interactive armband or necklace or something you can squeeze or whatever, that kind of stuff is sometimes hard to only get clear on using 2D visual techniques. You sometimes really need to make use of the 3D space and of material properties, how something feels, how big something is, how heavy something is. So if you bring materials that people can easily tinker with, I have found in many of workshops that this really adds a new layer of idea generation power and possibilities for reflecting on ideas. Now, if you already have ideas, and maybe this would be something for session 2 or session 3, if you do multiple co-design sessions, you could bring mock-ups of your designs to the session. And then instead of only evaluating the product, like do you like this product and which product do you like best, the use of these kinds of mock-ups is twofold. One, to have an evaluation, but that more in the sense of what does each of the different concepts bring, not only in positive but also in negative sense, and not just to choose which one is the best, right? That's not the goal here, but for each of the different concepts to find out what specific value does that kind of concept bring relative to the others, so that you can then discuss what do you actually find most important for a product, right? And then it could be that in the end you're going to merge some of these concepts or create a whole new kind of product concept based on that. So the mock-ups are not just evaluated as products like this should we choose or not. The mock-ups are examples of underlying ideas or directions that you then discuss with your end users. So talk also about the ideas behind it, and not just about do you like this product better than the other one. And then of course you can also elaborate on it. So in a co-design session you would never just ask what do you like about these concepts that I brought. You would also then provide materials to say to people, okay, can we now adapt or change or make a new mock-up based on the reflections and the discussions that we've just had together, right? So you always make it generative, you always create something together rather than just evaluating or analyzing. Now you can also do this remotely, asking people maybe even in groups to join a kind of a group chat and then make something, send their ideas in the group chat and then discuss it online together. Especially during the COVID crisis, we tried, of course, to do all kinds of things online and at a distance. And it worked actually quite well. One interesting aspect of this is that people are actually doing tinkering, making stuff in their own environment rather than that they come to a special place. So if the product also should be used in that environment, then they are being creative in the environment where they actually want to use the product, which could be interesting. And you could do this for different parts of the design project, right? Like you could also do it for just exploring what kind of materials do you like, or do you have a certain feeling associated with it. Famous material for co-design is Legos, because of course with Lego you have a whole toolkit just ready by buying a box of Legos. Big blocks, small blocks, little puppets, and people can create all kinds of scenarios or stories or metaphors using Legos, and then you could put the Legos also on a canvas and let people write about it or discuss what was happening around it. One thing that I want to say about Legos is it's very dominant as a form factor. So it makes it easy for people to create something, but it also immediately takes a lot of their possible creativity away, because they are now completely zoomed in on this Lego language, as it were. So, for example, if people want to make something round and there is no round shape in the Legos, then they never even attempt it. And nobody would say, oh, I'm now going to take a saw and saw this piece of Lego in half or something because that's what I need. Because that's something you don't do with Legos. Whereas if you bring cardboard, people immediately start cutting and creating their own specific forms that they have in mind. So that's something to keep in mind, that it's a easy, it has a low threshold for starting to work with it for people, even people that are a little bit afraid and say, oh, I'm not creative or I can't draw. Legos might be an easy step in, but it has its limitations in that sense. I never use it. Future use boards was a technique that student Valerie Menke of mine used. It's based on previous information about the user context. So you take the context information and then you make little boards that you place in the situation that you want to design for. And you create little story scenarios by placing the boards in different selection and order each time. So out of the context materials, you take the objects and the aspects and the processes and the situations of the context, and then you by making them in separate little boards, you put the boards in a certain order. You make little storylines, little comic stories, as it were, on the fly, and you can very easily make different stories. And if you just make a photo of each intermediate result, you have a whole bunch of stories in the end. By the way, I want to emphasize here, as well as in some of the other examples that I showed earlier, that of course the pictures don't mean anything if you don't know the story. So you let people tell the story. You should also record that story, because 3 weeks later you have no idea anymore what we're looking at now. What I see is a woman and a man talking, and I see a man with a finger to its head behind it. I have no idea what that means. Only the two people there in that session, they know what it means. And probably if you ask Valerie, who is sitting there in the front, what does that mean, that card, she doesn't know anymore either, of course, because it was years ago. So you need to record what people are telling about the pictures, and that goes also for all the other exercises. Okay, and here as well, reflecting on use scenario. So you could make a use scenario. Sometimes people find it difficult to make this kind of storyboards, little comic stories where you sort of tell the story of how to use the product, right? But it could be very useful for you to make one and then have a discussion about that instead of only talking about it, because then it stays very abstract for people. They have to imagine it in their heads. So everything they have to imagine is difficult. So maybe if you make that explicit in terms of a nice story, a visual story. First you activate the light, then you program it on your tablet, then you put the light somewhere with a magnet on the wall, then you program it again. I have no idea what this story is about, but of course for the people that are involved in the project, this kind of visualizations would make a lot of sense because they've already been discussing it together. And then it helps as a kind of reminder, oh yeah, this is the order of things, this is how the product should be used. And then people can put sticky notes on it, or say something about it, and you record it, and so on and so forth. So a lot of this is about creating something and then reflecting on it together, having the conversation around it. Now I want to show a few things that I saw at a conference, and also to show there's many different kind of co-design techniques, and people invent their own new techniques almost with every new study, because it's always for a particular user group, it's always for a particular situation. So you want to make materials and exercises that really fit to that particular project, and so that often means you can't just use ready-made methods that apply to everything. That's not how it works. So this was for a shoe company. They wanted to have new ideas for products. And how do you get to know something about what your user group actually likes, right? That's not something that is often asked of consumers of shoes, buyers of shoes. So they asked people things, where do you keep your shoes in your house, and to give comments about it in little workbooks, and people send them back to the company. So this is a generative toolkit, a inspiration toolkit that people were sent at home. And comparable thing to ask children about their experiences and feelings by making a whole setting of this is my living room, and with all kinds of blocks with with icons on it that mean something. People, the children could make their storylines, and this empowers children, and really helps also therapists and adults to take these experiences very seriously, because children, of course, might find it difficult to voice it and just eloquently talk about it as some adults can. And finally, this is also an interesting example. Sometimes it's difficult to talk about things because they have some kind of intimacy, and also because they are very close to you, like the body, and how do you feel, how does something feel to you? So for example, how does it feel to use a prosthetic leg? And so this co-designer used dolls, and you could paper dolls, and you could dress them, and then she had stories, talked with them, with the kids, and had stories with them. And then in the meantime, she also got to know a lot about the prosthetic leg and what kids would find important about it, talking about stigma, feeling, identity, and so on and so forth. So talking about a sensitive topic in a playful way. All right, so now there's a lot of these co-design toolkits with exercises in them. We have one that is for you on Canvas. That's a very basic one with it's also not with all this creative materials yet in it, so you have to bring that yourself and add to it. The exercises are more about what do you do together and what questions can you ask. So it's just a starting point for you to become creative with. But there's also other stuff online that you can look into. There's, of course, the design thinking school in Stanford. They have some tools online. The Make Tools approach by Sanders and Stappers that we've talked about a lot already is online with a lot of materials. There is, I found something called Co-Design Tools. I don't even know what it is, but it looked interesting. There's some hogescholen that made materials. They are often much better than universities at making concrete materials that you can actually use. At the Zuidhogeschool and also Hogeschool Utrecht, so Universities of Applied Sciences. And there's some other references here that I will put for you online, and you can have a look at it, browse through it, and become inspired and create your own things. So this is what the toolkit looks like. You have a topic, adjusting the work environment. It says, why do this activity? How long would it take? And then what do you need to do to prepare? An example, how do you complete it? And then there's a whole bunch of cards that you can use. So you see, it's very basic, but it's also very clear in steps. So if you find it difficult to start, you can just start with selecting some of these co-design exercises and say, okay, we're going to do this one. And then maybe you get ideas about, oh, we could actually bring the Legos or the Play-Doh or the other kind of cardboard objects to make this activity more rich or interesting. That's up to you. So this would really be a good moment to take a moment of silence and close your eyes and realize how long you've already been listening to this lecture, sitting behind a screen. Maybe close your eyes from the screen for a moment, stand up, walk away, and do a little meditation. Chapter 7, Design Your Own Co-Design Workshop. So I'm going to briefly walk you through the steps you need to take in order to actually do the workshop. And I'm going to tell it to you in the way you would do it for a master graduation assignment, for example. So some of this stuff doesn't apply here. First, you need to get clear on practical constraints, budget, deadlines, etc. That's not really relevant for you right now. You already know how much time you have, but maybe it's good to still have a look at the project deadlines and so on. And then the first thing you do is define a goal. So given where you are right now in the design project, what would you actually need to know? What do you actually want to get out of the session? Because if you're just going to do a co-design workshop because you have to do a co-design workshop, but you have no goal, then yeah, probably the results will be quite uninteresting. So if you know what kind of step you wish to take in your design, like you want to get some first ideas, or no, you already have 20 ideas, you want to get more clear on what main direction you really want to go into and what directions you don't want to go into. Those are already two different goals depending on different phases in your design project, right? So determine for yourself, where are you now in your design process, and what would you like to involve the user into so that they can help you take this next step. Now you want to determine some practical constraints, like are you allowed to visit the person? Is there a big room? Is there a space? Is there a separate room where you can work, and so on? Not just the constraints in terms of what isn't possible, but also have a look at what is possible, right? So what are the opportunities there? Oh, there is a big sitting room in the company where the coffee machine also is, and there's actually a very big table there with materials, and we can already use it. Well, use it, right? Use what is there. Build further on the possibilities that are given to you by this particular user in this particular context. Oh, the user really likes to cook. Well, maybe we could do a cooking session together and use that as a starting point for getting to know each other. Oh, the user really likes to do crochet or knitting. Oh, maybe we're going to bring a lot of that kind of stuff, and we're going to make something of fabric together. Right, so think along with what is possible and not just what is not possible. Create a rough plan. You need to normally then arrange ethical permission, and I put that first because that might take a long time, so you can still do the details of designing the whole workshop later. But for you this doesn't apply because we already have the ethical permission. Plan a date, but by the way, what we are going to do on Thursday and Friday is actually do this in the sense of making a rough plan and then writing an ethical information brochure, right? So we're going to do this. So we're going to do this exercise as an exercise in any case. Then you plan your date and time and location, and you invite participants even before you really design the details of the workshop. Why? Well, this is very important. Very often what happens is people spend a lot of time preparing a very nice workshop, and then they call up the people that they want to invite and they say, can you come tomorrow, because that is the last day that we can still do it and we have a deadline. Well, people cannot just come tomorrow, right? So people need to know in advance, well in advance, so they can plan a day, an evening or an afternoon free to help you out. And then once you have set the date and people know it and put it in their calendars, then you still have 2 weeks to actually prepare. So you need to think the other way around. First secure the date and the time and the place, and then organize the details. It's like planning a wedding. First the location, and then you have a whole year left to plan your wedding. So if this ever becomes relevant, it's exactly the same thing. So get inspiration from the lecture and the literature. That's this lecture. So what did you learn from this, and what do you want to apply? And then you design the workshop in detail. And what you could do is you could have a home assignment so that people already bring something to the workshop. This is optional, but if you want to do it, that would be nice. Just see if you think that's realistic and possible for your participant also. Then you need to think about a welcome and an introduction, an energizer, setting the boundaries together, making sure that everybody's on the same page and that everybody knows what the session is about. So that's the first part of the session. Then often you're going to do some kind of recap of the context mapping, maybe referring back to your earlier interview and your site visit, and getting clear on, okay, this is the situation, this is who you are, maybe some exercise about, again, letting people talk about themselves or showing themselves in some way. And then you're really going to dive into the actual creative activity. So you choose a particular method or technique for creating ideas. Then you need to have time and materials for people to actually make something. Can be a mock-up of sorts. And then you need to have some time to let people present to you what they made and talk about it. And that's very important. So you don't just want the prototype, you want the story behind it and the reflection on it. People, if it would be great if people are literally looking at their own thing and saying, oh, and what's also important about it is, and then say something that's also important about this. That is the kind of information that you hope to get, right? So that the prototype helps them to think about what they really find important. Make sure you record it or write down everything like crazy. Then and make photos of the prototypes and of the people. Make sure to record this session. Then you evaluate and reflect together and you determine next steps. So this means in your time plan, you need to have time all the way up to part 6. Whereas part 4 and 4, oh, there's 2 parts 4. Well, it sort of belongs together, right? But part 4 is actually probably going to take a lot of time. So make sure to have enough time for parts 5 and 6. Now, and then there's a whole bunch of things you can do before you're actually going to do this plan, because this is still the plan, right? You have now thought of how you're going to do it and written it down into a whole co-design plan. You have to create the materials. Behind me, I don't know what is behind me, but it's important to make sure that the people actually know that you're going to come the next day. Send them a reminder, do a test run with some friends. I think that always helps a lot. If you have the time, already do the exercise yourself, and then you find out immediately that I don't know, step 2 is just too long, it takes too long, or step 4 is completely unclear, or somebody made step 4 and then another made another step 4 and the numbers are wrong, and you can still correct it. Okay, so then you actually execute the workshop in the end, and after the workshop, don't forget, you need to take then the next step. What are the design implications of your findings? So you have a lot of material. You have stories, prototypes, people wrote things on sticky notes, what have you, but what are you going to do with it? Now, we're also going to discuss that, of course, in the project lectures and workshops, but that's a very important step to take. You want to take information out of this workshop and then actually make the design. So if we very briefly run through the start, how do you start? Well, step 1 is to define the goal. So what is the question that you wish to answer with the co-design workshop? What information would you miss if you would not do this workshop, right? What would go wrong if you don't do this workshop? Why is this workshop needed? Get clear on that first. Then you're going to find out what the context is like. Oh, I once did a workshop, for example, and it was in the summer. It was very hot, and there was a school, but it was really in the middle of a forest. So I went there the first day, and I knew that the next day I had to do this workshop together with a group of people, and I immediately thought I'm going to do something outside. So we decided to make a hut together. And there was a specific exercise that I thought about how to make this hut. And then through that, we got to know a lot about everybody's values, ideas, your way of looking at things, your perception in life. So it was actually an exercise in exploring your own personal values, which was important for the project. But we did it through making a hut in the forest. I would have never done that if I would have been in the winter in the middle of a city, because there wouldn't be a forest, right? So you have to think also about the context. You've already been there. What is possible there? So another workshop we did at a school, and we found out there's this fantastic nice playroom with all kinds of stuff. So of course, if you're going to work with kids, you can sit them behind a little table and have them draw something on the table, but they do that all the day already, and they're going to be restless and annoyed, and they don't have patience. So why not let them do a whole parkour around the room, and then have little exercises and questions in between, or have them say something, or do something together, or do a little theater play while they can also run around. Right? So think about your user group, what they like, think about the possibilities that are there. So also think about the participant themselves, of course. What can they do? I once did a workshop with students. I know students are on their phone all day. I'm myself just the same. So they are very easy with phones. So I did an exercise about getting to know each other. And what I did was just say, take one photo out of your photo stream that really tells something symbolically important about yourself. And then show it to another person, and then I had them move around in circles. So these are little exercises that tap into the natural behaviors and habits of the people that you work with, right? And of course, the empathy map that you already made about your own user can help out here. Like what do they say, think, do, and feel normally? So what is their way of being? And can you connect to that with your exercises and the form of your exercises? Also think about your own role. So if the user is pretty independent, you can be more like a facilitator and giving inspiration and so on. If the person finds it very difficult to get to any action, then you have to be more in the lead and take them and guide them step by step through the process. So you have to make a sort of an estimation of how strong your control is going to be over the process. Of course, you want to have control over the beginning and the ending and make sure that you get your data and your information out of it. But in terms of working together within the activity, you could be more leaning back and letting people do it all by themselves, or you could really be taking them by the hand step by step. And this depends a little bit on what you think your user group is capable of and interested in doing. So browse through the toolkit, select things you like. You can still use some of the context mapping exercises even within your brainstorm session, within your co-design session, because the first part of a co-design workshop is often a kind of setting the context again, getting clear on, what is the situation, who is the user. So you do that together with the user. But you have already some information because you already went there. So you can maybe also bring photos and materials from your earlier visit to the co-design workshop and give it some kind of place and function. You have to think about ideation exercises and about how you're going to evaluate and reflect on it together in the end to draw some conclusions. And then think about what materials would support the creative process, right? So you can create canvases. There's also some prefab cards and canvases in the toolkit already, but maybe you want to make better ones, nicer ones that are more appropriate to your specific user group. You can also think about how abstract ideas or processes or steps or concepts can be represented in a more tangible way, so people can also, like these scenario cards that we discussed earlier, you can put them on the table and take them away and reorder them. That's always nice for people to not do everything in their head, but to have physical things to work with. And you can provide tools for making prototypes so that things can be experienced and shown and expressed. Oh, I have an idea for a product that would be like this. Oh, well, make it and show it, right? Show and tell is actually the one, if I would have one phrase summarizing the whole idea of this co-design workshop, is show and tell. Make, show and tell.